Estás viendo Canal América, televisión dominicana para el mundo.
Sometimes life can be so damn hard. You don't know where to go. Everything keeps falling apart. Yeah. You try to do your best, but only God knows that you've given everything you've got, but the world takes you down. You just keep moving on. Let your fears.
So welcome to A Time for Truth. And today we have a very interesting show. In the last year, our country has been torn apart. Tremendous strife, division, and a lot of things happening that really are not favorable for our democracy, our freedoms in this country, for all of us, for all of the Americans, regardless of creed, religion, color. It's something that has been causing tumult, and today we're going to have a very honored an important guest who has tremendous experience in this field. There's been a lot of talk about defunding the police, about changing the structure of the way we maintain security in our communities. And so I want to introduce our guest, an engineer, if you can put his pictures on. Our guest today is Reverend Frederick Shaw of Compton, California. He's a fierce advocate for children, adults, in civic and human rights, stressing education, reducing poverty and drug addiction. He is the director of public affairs and spokesperson for a group called the Citizens Commission on Human Rights International, CCHR, a more than 50-year mental health industry watchdog protecting our population. Mr. Shaw is also executive director and president of the NAACP Englewood South Bay branch, California, and past president of the Compton branch. He's ordained in religious science and was done so at Pepperdine University back in 1965. He was a Los Angeles County sheriff and deputy organizing and implementing the Sheriff Youth Athletic League from 1980 to 1993. And I want to emphasize that he was a policeman before the show begins, so he has tremendous experience in this field. He's co-founder and president of the World Literacy Crusade, an international organization with the purpose of eradicating poverty and hopelessness in the inner cities through education. He co-founded the Basic Life Institute, serving at-risk youth. In South Africa, he attended the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and his role in CCHR, and presented much evidence on the role of psychiatric and psychological racism in introducing and maintaining apartheid, and how Africans were allowed to die from conditions which were easily treated medically. In November of 2016, he led a march in South Africa for African children that were subjected to dangerous psychotropic drugs. And he leads many CCH marches protesting the electric shocking of children. He protects children and his group around the world. He is amazing. I mean, I could go on and on here, but there's some things that are very important to state about the Reverend, that he helped obtain 3 national resolutions that supported children's rights not to be subjected to coercive psychotropic drugs. and to stop the drugging of foster care children and prevent electric shock. Quite an amazing man. He worked to get internationally to get the Child Medication Safety Act passed with Congress, which prohibits schools from forcing students to take psychotropic drugs as a requisite for their education, and reinforcing the parents' rights to control their children's lives and to refuse to have treatments that they didn't agree with. He was awarded by the LA County Board of Supervisors for his work with foster care children and youth. He was recipient of the Men Who Care Award, along with actor Jamie Foxx, for his leadership skills and persistence in eliminating the drugging of children. He's quite amazing. He instituted a task force in 2020 against institutional racism in the psychiatric industry. And basically, he wanted to expose to all people and African Americans of the mental health industry's history of stigmatizing minorities, from labeling runaway slaves and civil rights protesters as mentally ill, and the use of eugenics, which is population control, which was targeted on African Americans, sterilizing them. Really, he's worked tremendously over a long period of time on human rights and protecting against these abuses. An engineer, if you put him on the screen, I want to welcome Reverend Shaw to A Time for Truth.
Thank you so much for allowing me this opportunity to be on your show. And thank you for that introduction. Now people know why I have all the gray hair in my beard, because of the fact there's been a lot out there that's been done. And, but we must keep fighting for the rights of our children.
It's amazing. When I was looking over your curriculum vitae, I didn't know what I was going to take out, because everything you've done to protect and to educate is amazing. But I want to get right to what we want to talk about on this show, because it's a very important topic in our country today, with the police, with what you have been fighting with the psychotropic and psychiatric influences. And really, I know you have a lot on this subject and what's been happening and the killings. So I really want to ask you to go ahead and I want to give you a little free rein, because you have a wealth of knowledge, so you can educate our viewers. Go ahead, Mr. Shaw.
Well, I would thank for that. I really would like to begin by making a statement that if we're in a shooting competition and they give me the wrong target to shoot at, there's no for me to win that competition. If we look on the surface and we see the interaction of law enforcement and the African American community, but we don't know some of the things that lie behind that. We don't know the medical model that comes out of psychiatry that even creates the images that we see depicted of African Americans. We see what you mentioned is the background where mental health or psychiatry has never been a friend of the African American community, starting back with Dr. Benjamin Rush, who's the father of psychiatry, who goes down in history as an abolitionist. He signed the Declaration of Independence and did all of these things, and he goes down as this great man, but he held slaves himself, and he's the one that came up with the idea of negritude, that said that Black people's skin was dark because he's akin to leprosy, and that white people should stay away from us, and the only way to know that a Black was cured or sane was if he turned white. And this philosophy, which had nothing to do with science, went down through the ages. And one doctor, currently, we could find the research on it, said that 50% of the medical doctors right now today believe that Black people's nerve endings are less sensitive than whites, and that we have a greater tolerance for pain. So when you go into the hospital, sometimes you need medication. People get the idea that you're faking it and stuff. This disparity, a lot of this comes straight out of the field of mental health or psychiatry.
Amazing. You know what? I'm a surgeon of 40 years, and people joke with me in my office. They say my office is like the United Nations of dental care, because I have people of all nationalities, all races. And I got to tell you, Fred, you're totally 100% right. I haven't found any human being, regardless of his religion or creed or color, that loves pain. They all react equally. They all want me to get them numb and comfortable. They all want to be treated fairly. And so, it's ludicrous to think that actually occurred. I wanted to ask you something, because you have been a policeman for how many years?
I was a Los Angeles County Sheriff Deputy here in California for 13 years.
For 13 years. So you have tremendous experience. So I wanted to ask you, because one of the things I think our viewers and our country needs to realize is, there's no such thing as right now as perfection. But in America, we have a system that works and it's workable. We don't want to destroy a workable system. So what I wanted to ask you, with your experience, is what is the truth of what goes on? What are some of the things that need to be corrected? Why have they occurred? How do you think they could be corrected in a more amenable way, rather than cutting and segregating? And tell me.
Well, that's a great question. The first thing I want to say, that it is it could seem like a lot of a number, but 15%, I believe, of law enforcement can be bad or have the tendency to be bad. In saying that, 85% of the officers that I've ever come across met would run into a burning building to save a life of a person of color. And I know that because, see, things ain't always the way we think they are. I've had people defend me who I would have swore was racist, but then they defended me. And then I've had people who I thought cared for me, double-cross me, backstab me, do a whole bunch of things. So what this means is that just like we look at race, we must look at law enforcement on an individual basis. For example, yes, this system may be systemically racist, but I can't call you, because you're an individual who, based on your practices, include people of all races. During the Underground Railroad, it was white people who gave the hiding spots and stuff for the slaves to be able to find freedom. During the Civil Rights Movement, it was James Gardner and Charlton Heston and Marlon Brando and all of those guys who stood with Dr. Martin Luther King and Harry Belafonte and all those ministers to help bring civil rights to the point where everybody could have it. So when we start blanketly saying white people, law enforcement and stuff, we're missing the boat. There are good people in every race, and there are bad people in every race. There are black people who double-cross black people. So we can't we got to start looking at people on an individual basis. Whites and the blacks and the Hispanics and all of them come together to change this system for the better. And that's the way to improve lives. 50 years from now, we'll be having the same, like we're having 50-year fights that started 50 years ago. So, I think that's what we need to look at and understand. And that doesn't, excuse behavior that is not tolerable by society. But at the same time, we must be able to look at this in a broader picture and figure out how we can help one another and work together and make things happen. A person like yourself giving me an opportunity to say these things, that's important in the dialogue of progress.
Absolutely. I was reading some different things, and I viewed different commentaries talking about defunding the police and utilizing that money for mental health care. And so one of the things I wanted to ask you, because I see, you know, being from this field, you're an expert on this, is I don't understand how that would be a positive. And from my viewpoint as a doctor, because what I've seen is that unfortunately, these people who are treated eventually are put on drugs. They're put on methadone, they're put on Suboxone, they're put on Zoloft, and they're put on all these drugs. Now, these drugs are extremely expensive, and I don't know where that money is being saved if we switch from that versus, you know, trying to keep justice and integrity. So I wanted to ask you on this subject to give your opinion, because you're the expert on this field, and so I would like you to do a little discourse on this, please.
Well, the thing is that we, first of all, let us deal with the fact that law enforcement, if they sent the money that they're talking about in Los Angeles, here we're talking about redirecting $100 million from law enforcement to mental health. Well, first of all, based on what I know, from here to South Africa, mental health is far more racist than law enforcement. And so, again, that's where the medical model for a lot of this came from. So to take it and from law enforcement to mental health, I think is flawed in the thinking. Why wouldn't we put that $100 million in programs that enhance the community? Why wouldn't we put that $100 million in vocational training and educational training? Why wouldn't we give people what they need so that they don't have to be in the mental health system, and we can prevent that, like giving medical examinations to people so we can determine, are they suffering from dehydration, or do they have a brain tumor? Is there a problem with the thyroid? All of those type of things can be looked at if a guy is anemic or not, or if he's depressed. I mean, how do you really look at him and tell the difference without doing a medical examination? So if we're going to redirect the money, let's redirect the money to where it benefits the people and not just the psychiatrists who get paid in mental health and become fat on the misery of the people. I'd like to say this. When we look at psychiatry, you know, look at their fruit. The fruit of psychiatry is the homeless population has veterans are killing themselves at 20 to 22 a day. Those are the type of things that we're looking at. More people walking the street, fighting themselves, body jerks and tics and things like that. This is the fruit. An educational system that has failed completely, where African Americans are disproportionately labeled with mental disorders, mathematical disorders, because they have not taught the kids and now they call it a mental illness and they can profit on that. These are the things that we got to start looking at and addressing. And if we're going to redirect money, then it's got to be somewhere where it benefits everybody. Now, I know that there are certain groups, Black Lives Matter being one, who are asking for defunding. I personally say to defund the police is ludicrous, because it's already known in areas where police act off, police have quit, the homicide rate and the shooting rates have gone up. And so I don't think that's the right thing to do. And I want the audience to know, and I'm not coming on here to say anything negative about Black Matter or anything like that, but Black Lives Matter is an organization and it's also a movement, and the two are not the same. So I may not, and I'm just giving a hypothetical, be a part of Black Lives Matter, the group. I'm part of the Black Lives, because everybody's life should matter, but Black lives should matter, especially when they're taken in a way that's seen inhumane and unjust. So those things, a lot of the ministers and stuff have gathered around on the idea of Black Lives Matter, but a lot of them may not be part of the Black Lives Matter group. That's take anything away from what those people are doing, because I'm not here to create a war with them. I'm here to bring truth to the table so we all can get along. And those that don't want to get along, then they can get. But we need to be able to work together as a team and make things happen.
Absolutely. One of the things that, that as I was preparing for the show with you, that I realized as I was looking, is that how is it just to blame police for people who are on psychiatric drugs and drugs out of their mind? I was reading that 90% of shootings, this person was on a psychiatric drug, which is never reported in the media for some reason unbeknownst to me. And what I was looking at is in New York City here, because I run a drug education program called Drug Free World, NYPD took the program in, did it, educated the kids in the schools, educated their officers. I don't want to name any names. Many of them really are so steadfast that we can't just regulate, incarcerate. They want to educate. They want to prevent. But not to put these people on drugs, because the police themselves also realize that if we put these citizens on drugs, they're going to have more crime, more shootings. So Fred, I wanted to ask you, how is it a just thing to say we're going to defund the police when the police are the effect of these people that are on drugs? And isn't it that we should treat by the drugs to get people off of the drugs? What's your feeling on this?
You've told the whole story right there. We need to deal with the issues and the effects of these drugs. And if you notice, I didn't say side effects. I said the effects of these drugs, because what we're looking at with the tendency for suicide by cop and things like that. See, nobody's addressing that, but a lot of these killings are suicide cop. If a person has a gun on you and they have the authority to you and you run at them, or you put your hands behind your back and you walk on them, or do something like that, that officer has the same right as everybody else to go home to protect himself. And just because he say police does not mean he doesn't have fear. Now, that doesn't mean that we can just shoot people. And I know I can hear somebody saying that doesn't justify. We're not talking about it. There's an issue with the psychiatric drugs where it tells us in the commercials that they can cause suicidal tendencies, okay, and actions. So if they can cause suicidal tendencies and actions, then what is a suicide? A suicide is simply a homicide done to yourself. So if you will kill yourself, then who come to you, you kill them also. So law enforcement officers go to suicide calls with their guns out, because a suicide person, they take people with them. So when you put them on a drug, I mean, let me just say this. What sense do it make that if you're thinking of committing suicide, that they give you a drug, a suicidal warning label on it? How is that supposed? It's not. What we do is we see a field that gets paid to create the conditions that they have to fix. So it's like the fox guarding the hen house. Tell our farmer, we need more foxes. Somebody's eating the hens when it's the foxes eating the hens all along. So, that's what we have to look at. And like I tell people in my speeches and stuff, don't believe me, believe the commercials. They tell you.
Very interesting point to bring out. It's funny in that corollary, a little story you just told with the foxes killing the hens, and the farmer, I guess, is there trying to figure it out, and his dogs are trying to protect against these foxes, but there's not enough dogs, and now you're going to defund the dogs because not the police are dogs, but just an example. And now the farmer loses more hens. It's amazing to me, because I was born in Cuba, and I was very lucky to come to this country. I know, this is an issue for another time, but we're all immigrants, and really we got to take a look at how we can get along together, because the point I wanted to make is that we have a workable country. We have a workable system that we've all fought so much for. Fred, I wanted to ask you something, because with this topic of the police and the racism and whatever, what do you feel is the real intent behind why this is being promulgated and expanded. How do you see this in terms of the country's future if it were to continue?
Well, let me start that off by saying this. When I was in law enforcement, when I left, the police departments were leaning toward what they call verbal judo and de-escalation things. Now they got people like Dr. David Grossman, a professor of psychology at West Point, who goes across the nation and for 20 years now been teaching an approach called, I think it's Bulletproof Mind, and it has a concept called Killology. Killology teaches you to kill without hesitation, without reservation, and without the feeling of guilt. In fact, David Grossman goes so far as to tell police officers, if you kill someone, you will have better sex at night. So the type of stuff that was allowed to be in, and a lot of law enforcement don't even agree with this type of training, because you're talking about a military type approach to dealing with citizens. And law enforcement should be protecting and serving, not declaring war on a group of its own citizens. And that's where the problem is, and of course, enforcement has an extreme amount of interaction with a particular group, inner city group, poor people, whatever, and you go with that approach, then you're going to shootings. And if you create the fear in law enforcement officers that they can die at any moment, then the chances of them overreacting, because all of us want to survive, all make it, because so I think that's what lies behind it. I think there has to be a system in place where law enforcement officers are judged just like citizens are judged, because everybody has the right to protect themselves and fear for their life. You can't fear me because I'm 6'6", 270, and I'm standing 10 feet away from you, and you have a gun and I'm unarmed. I don't know what makes you think you're fearing for your life at that point. However, if a size rush you or try to get you in that situation, you may have to go to drastic measures, especially if I'm trained in any form and there's no way for you to know that. So what we need to do is come to a very practical approach on how law enforcement will be penalized. The unions have to meet us halfway, and when something is egregious, they cannot stand in the door trying to save the officer with great injustice. But at the same time, we must make sure we remove the blanket of hate and distrust when 85% of law enforcement officers are saving lives and risking their lives, and they don't get to run when they get into a situation. They have to handle it.
Absolutely. You know what, Fred? It's been a pleasure having you on the show. And I want to have you back because we have a lot more topics to cover. Unfortunately for today, we've run out of time. But as we end this show, I want our viewers to look at this and look at what someone who's an expert in the field has put out today. Think with it. Let's see how we can, like Mr. Shaw said, Reverend Shaw, how do we work together? How do we keep this country great? How do we make it free for all, just for all? It's never going to be perfect, but let's improve it. I want to thank you for watching, and I want to bid you a great weekend from A Time for Truth. Be well, and we will see you on our next show. And thank you, Reverend Shaw. Great talk.
Thank you.
Sometimes life can be so damn hard. You don't know where to go. Everything keeps falling apart. Yeah. You try to do your best, but only God knows that you've given everything you've got, but the world takes you down. You just keep moving on. Let your feet